This is Declarations.
There were two drivers among the reasons that we grew. One, we were investing so much capital in this pretty focused geography that we realized along the way that we were creating value all around us. Second driver in the growth was the firm wasn't going to attract, nor was it going to retain the top talent, the really super talent you need to go execute on an investment plan at scale and provide opportunity for those folks. The more opportunity you present, the more folks want to come to work for you.
Hi, this is Todd Rich, and welcome back to the Declarations podcast. The purpose of the Declarations podcast is to engage in deep conversations with thought leaders in investing and investments, especially with those who provide an independent perspective. Our goal with the podcast is to explore the foundation behind the success of some of the world's best investors and to understand the source of their inspiration. Hopefully, by hearing their stories, we can all become better investors. We're excited to welcome Michael Glosserman today. Michael is a close personal mentor of mine and a member of Declarations Real Estate Advisory Board. Michael and I were partners at my prior firm, the JBG Companies, and I'm proud to note that Michael and his family have continued to invest with us here at Declaration. Michael's also been instrumental in my own personal growth, and I'm grateful for his mentorship and his friendship. Michael's a living legend in the Washington, D.C. real estate sector. Trained as a lawyer, Mike began his career with the U.S. Department of Justice and moved quickly over to commercial real estate. After 7 years at the Rouse Company, Mike joined JBG, where he spent 28 years and served as the chair of the executive committee for almost 10 of those years. He's now a member of the JBG Smith Board of Trustees. Michael also used to serve on the board of the CoStar Group, a leading provider of online information and analytics for property markets. For his efforts, Michael was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award by the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Urban Land Institute. Through it all, Michael still loves barbecue and retains his Texas twang. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here, Todd. Looking forward to talking to you.
Well, thanks. Michael, you know this, because you were really here from the beginning. But as you know, we named our business after the Declaration of Independence. And I've always viewed the Declaration as a foundational document that also lays out the aspirational nature of the American experiment. So, Michael, here's the leading question. What is your declaration?
You know, Todd, you warned me that you were going to be asking me this question. So I had some time to think about it. And I thought that, in earlier years, I think I would have talked about personal and professional goals and objectives. But as I close in on 80, my perspective has changed. And I would say that my declaration is be in the moment. None of us knows what awaits us.
So what does it mean to you to live in the moment, to be in the moment?
It means that you and I should really enjoy this conversation right now and make the most of it. Because when we walk out, when we finish, you don't know what's going to happen to you this afternoon, and neither do I. So really all we have is this moment. And I think that is something that we should all strive to focus on.
That's beautiful. Now, you mentioned that your perspective has changed over the years. And so maybe let's go back to the beginning. Tell us, so you grew up in Lockhart, Texas, a small town, about halfway between Austin and San Antonio. What was that like?
It was idyllic. It was what I would characterize as a classic 50s, early 60s, very small town environment. And everyone knew everybody else. There was certainly what I would call ethnic stratification, but there wasn't economic stratification. everyone was approximately middle class. Some had more than others, but folks went out of their way not to demonstrate that if they did. I had a particularly interesting experience because my family is Jewish. My dad was born in Lockhart in 1903.
How big a town was this?
When I grew up, it was 4,000 or 5,000 people. There were only a handful of Jewish families in Lockhart, and two of my dad's brothers, and he remained in the town and had businesses there. And so my first cousins, I had a couple of first cousins, and my sisters, I had 4 sisters, were the only Jewish kids in school. So I grew up in a very Christian, very Catholic. There was also extremely high percentage of Hispanic population in the town. And so all of my friends were of different faiths, Hispanic, Caucasian. So I had this very broad exposure to people in this, what turned out to be, after I left and was able to look back, this bubble, that this cocoon that I grew up in.
And how do you think that shaped you?
I think this gave me a broad exposure to a variety of people and to a variety of classes of people, just to a, I would say just to a broad, it socialized me in a way that I would not have been socialized in a large city.
The irony there reminds me, of F. Scott Fitzgerald, right? That the most intimate parties are the large ones, right? In the sense that you're saying that a small town gave you a very broad and diverse exposure, whereas if you were in a big city, you might have been more narrowed. It's fascinating.
My family, we belonged to 2 synagogues. We belonged to a synagogue in Austin and a synagogue in San Antonio. And so I certainly grew up and I attended Sunday school. I was bar mitzvahed. But I would have to get on the road and drive to 2 other cities to go to temple. And I was certainly exposed to people of my faith in those cities. But when I came back to Lockhart, I attended Bible school in the summers. I attended Mass with my Catholic friends. I, trimmed Christmas tree. I never felt any level of discrimination. My dad, in addition to being an entrepreneur, was mayor of this little town.
Oh, I didn't realize that. But now you said in addition to being an entrepreneur, so your dad was an entrepreneur. I think your grandfather was an entrepreneur. I'm sure like all Texas stories, it had something to do with oil and gas and maybe.
Well, there was a town square and my father had a clothing store on the square. With my uncles, they had an automobile dealership off the square. My grandfather had a little food market on the square, and they were the only models I had. And then, as I say, my dad was mayor of this place for many, many years. So I never felt either singled out, and I always felt just, it was this melding pot of folks that I got enormous exposure to.
And how did you do that? I mean, you just told the story about how deep your roots were, Dad as mayor for many years. I mean, how did you decide to leave Lockhart and go to a city like Philadelphia?
I loved my experience of growing up in Lockhart. It was only later when I got away from Lockhart that when I could really reflect on it and look at it more realistically. It was clearly insular, and it was never a place that I thought I would return to. I always thought I would return to Texas, not the Lockhart.
So I had remembered you saying that you always wanted to return to Texas. I did not pick up on the nuance. So what was it when you left Lockhart and you went to Wharton for undergrad? What made you think that you were going to head back to Texas? What was your goal?
Well, just speaking for myself, obviously, it's hard to grow up in Texas. I left Texas basically when I was 18. I did go back and go to law school, but for all practical purposes, when I went away to college is when I left Texas. And it's hard to grow up, especially the way I did in this environment, and not believe you're going to be in Texas. It's just a way of life. And it's a place that I still today, when people ask me where I'm from, I say I'm from Texas. I mean, that's not where I live.
Mike, I feel the same way about New Jersey. I am from New Jersey through and through, so I understand. Our brisket isn't quite as good, but our music is.
So what happened was that I got my license when I was 14 to drive. By the time I was a sophomore and junior in high school, I was driving to Austin and San Antonio on dates or to parties or to do whatever I wanted to do.
As a dad of a 14-year-old, I'm glad that's no longer happening.
My older sister was at the University of Texas. I would go by to visit her, and I started going to fraternity parties at the University of Texas in Austin when I was a junior. And so by the time I was ready to apply to colleges, I'd always thought I'd go to the University of Texas as an undergrad. And I felt like in some ways, been there, done that, I'd like to try something different. And so I had heard about this business school, Wharton. I didn't know anything about it, but there was a family friend from another small town about 30 miles away who had gone to Penn. And I thought, well, I want to be a businessman, as
right.
we would say. And why not go to this business school? And so I wrote away and got the application.
So you said you wanted to be a businessman, but then after 4 years at Wharton, you then applied to law school. So what were you thinking then?
So that was completely different. So now I'm finished and I have a business degree. I'm going back to Texas, and in my mind, I need to be back in Texas. And so I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I thought a law degree would be effectively a reasonable way to get a graduate education. I might practice law, but I might not. But I would be back in Texas at Texas Law School. And from a relationship perspective and from, getting me some roots back, that was going to be the way I kind of re-entered Texas.
But then what happened? You graduated law school and decided immediately to leave Texas yet again, this time, I guess, for good. Moved back to Washington, D.C. You worked at the Department of Justice, but only for a year. And then you got into real estate. So what spurred all of that?
I would never recommend law school to anyone who's not fairly certain that they want to practice law.
All right.
I went to law school, and I can say that, the two best things for me that came out of law school were, I thought I knew how to write before I went to law school. I really didn't. And I learned how to write in law school, finally. And I met my late wife, Marilyn. She was an undergrad at the University of Texas. She was from East Texas, and we became engaged. And we both had large families in Texas, and we thought for the first couple of years of our marriage, why don't we see if let's go to another city, get out of Texas, go have some fun, and then we'll come back and get serious. And that was our plan. And so the Department of Justice was simply a ticket for me to get to Washington.
So the Department of Justice was your idea of having fun with your new bride.
Exactly. And living in a brand new place that neither of us had ever experienced.
But I guess you decided not to be a lawyer. You got into commercial real estate. So tell us, what was the inspiration? Why get into real estate from that early age?
I knew within about 6 months, I really didn't want to practice law. And it took me another 6 months to sort through the direction I wanted to go in. I had classmates who had been who lived in Chicago, who were in mortgage banking. And I had some litigation out in Chicago, and I visited with them, saw what they were doing. It got me interested in the real estate field. I didn't know what a developer was, by the way. So I began to do some research. I went to all the trade associations associated with real estate. I went to their libraries and did some research. Also got names of firms all around the country. And I decided this was the direction I wanted to head in. And I was hoping to use my finance degree primarily to get me into some sort of position having to do with finance and real estate.
And ultimately you became a mortgage broker.
I'll tell you a quick story about trying to get a job. I composed a letter to all of these people that I had identified through the associations all over the country that basically said what a hot ticket I was, what a kick-ass guy I was and how much initiative and energy I had. And I wanted to go to work for him. I got 100 rejections. I still have that file today. I'd be happy to show it to you sometime.
I hope you have that. I'd love to see those letters.
Here I was, Wharton undergrad, I couldn't get an interview.
Did that discourage you? Did that build your determination?
It was discouraging. It was very discouraging, but I persisted. The closest thing I had to a relative in Washington, a third, fourth cousin of my father's, who had sort of taken me under his wing. He was a former multifamily developer who had done well in Washington, and he knew a board member at the Rouse Company, which was one of the places I had tried to interview, but I couldn't get an interview. And he called the guy and said, look, I don't know if you guys are hiring or not, but I know this kid and you ought to talk to him at least. And I got an interview and they hired me to basically just work on financing of Rouse Company owned and developed assets, primarily their malls.
And for those there are people listening that may not recognize the name Rouse or understand just how transformational the Rouse Company was.
The Rouse Company was, at the time, I would say, not only the leading mall developer in the country, but Jim Rouse was a visionary, a true visionary. He's of all the folks that I've known and been close to in my life, he ranks up there in top three, if you will. He was an amazing individual, and he conceived of Columbia, Maryland. And so the Rouse Company developed Columbia, Maryland as well.
And for those real estate nerds listening, Columbia Town Center was, the first planned community in the United States, and it really became a model for development all across the country. And when you got that job, I guess you decided to make DC your home, right?
DC was home. We actually moved to Columbia, Maryland. That is where both of our sons were born. We were there for not quite 4 years. We never felt like we left Washington. I had a position there. I didn't know how long I would stay in Columbia, Maryland. By the way, all of this time, I'm still thinking one of these days we're going to return to Texas.
When did you buy? You bought your first home
I bought my first home. I bought my first home in 1973. It was a townhouse in Columbia. It involved the worst investment decision I've ever made because I bought it in the late 60s. My dad was always a follower well before he became known of Warren Buffett. And Berkshire Hathaway owned something called green stamps. It was traded. It was a partnership, and then it transitioned to being traded in something called pink sheets way back then. It wasn't on an exchange. You couldn't find any information about it. And my dad gave each of my sisters and me 60 shares of Berkshire Hathaway stock. So my first townhouse in Columbia was a $36,000 house. I needed a 10% down payment. I didn't know anything about this Berkshire Hathaway stock. It was something I could go sell and raise my down payment. I didn't go ask my dad for a loan, which is obviously what I should have done. Had I held up that stock, it would be worth over $46 million today. I know myself well enough to know that I would have sold that stock many times along the way, but still.
Hi, this is Todd Rich. Thank you for listening to the Declarations Podcast, where top investors and business leaders share their insights and provide an independent perspective. We hope you're enjoying this episode. If you'd like to learn more about Declaration Partners or listen to more episodes of the Declarations Podcast, please visit our website at www.declarationpartners.com. And now back to the episode. Okay, so now let's get into real estate. So you were at Rouse, legendary, but let's move on to JBG because that's really the crux of your career. You joined JBG instead of going back to Texas, and you thought you'd give it a try as really more of an entrepreneurial thing. What led you into that piece of real estate and to becoming a developer ultimately, and what was it that you were setting out to achieve?
Well, I reached a crossroads finally at Rouse. And by this time I had moved from Columbia back to Washington. I was running the mortgage banking office in Washington. I was running 6 or 7 other offices around the country. We had a little development, not a lot going on in Washington. I was responsible for that. But among my clients in Washington, I got to know the folks at JBG. And I developed a very close, both professional and personal relationship with all of the founders there, particularly Ben Jacobs.
And so what was JBG, for those who don't know?
JBG was a very small group of the founders were 3 guys who law firm partners together who did real estate deals, but they were lawyers first. So I was at this crossroads, had gotten to know the JBG folks. We had talked about literally for 2 years, my coming on board and joining them. So I came to a point where I needed to make a decision of whether I was going to remain at Rouse, join JBG, or go back to Texas. If I had gone back to Texas, I likely would have moved to Austin and would have been in business with my father, who had a small oil and gas operating company. And I would have somehow done a combination maybe of oil and gas and real estate. So I called my dad to sort of get his take on these choices I had. And my father gave me what has turned out to be some of the best advice I've ever received. JBG was easily the riskiest way to go. And he said, look, Texas is going to be here. And so try that. It may work. But if it doesn't work, you've lost a little time, but you will have learned something and you can come back then. And so I tried it.
A little safety net gave you the freedom to fly. And so what were you and your partners at JBG trying to achieve? What were your aspirations for JBG? And then tell a little bit about the journey, what JBG ultimately became under your leadership with your partners.
My history with JBG, I divide into sort of 5 periods. The first period would be, I joined JBG in 1979. We reconstituted the partnership and made it a 6-way partnership. At that time, we were the 3 founding partners, and Lou Rumford and Bob Brownlower were my other 2 partners. And so when I joined JBG, let's take the 80 to 90 period. The focus was what I wanted to do, and I think what everybody at the firm wanted to do: make some money, create some net worth deals, and create wealth.
This is the classic entrepreneurial deal-by-deal model.
It wasn't a lot of time spent on building a company. It was, we're doing real estate deals.
And then evolved from there. Tell us about the next phase.
Everything was going well until the late 80s when we had what in my experience was the worst downturn that I ever experienced. And I went through 5 of them. But there was financial crisis, and we spent the next 5 years just trying to survive. And so there was no time to think about company building or anything else. This was about survival from about 88 to about 91, 92, and really through the mid 90s.
I mean, Sam Zell always said, stay alive till 95, right? So
that's right. That was our focus. By 1995, our individual investors had always done well. we stayed out of trouble. We hadn't taken on a lot of recourse risk. And we were able which is, by the way, the thing I'm probably most proud of in JBG's history was the fact that our partnership remained intact throughout all of this. So we hung together and we came out of it, and we were by 1991 to 93 beginning to raise money on an individual deal by deal basis from our existing high net worth partners.
Okay. Back to playing offense.
And we were playing offense, and in fact, probably as a collection of transactions, that was probably the best period that I ever saw for buying real estate. There was terrific real estate at tremendously distressed prices. In 1995, Wall Street had discovered all of the bankrupt real estate developers. They were selling all this distressed real estate to the public market, basically. And that's when all the REITs began to get created, and the opportunity funds were back in business.
Institutional capital started deciding that real estate was an investable asset class at this period.
Precisely. And so we had, for a 4-year period, literally almost had the market to ourselves in Washington, because everything we did was Washington metro area. In 1995, we lost a deal by $250,000 to a group that had discretionary funds. And that's why we lost the transaction. We were the better price. We had a great reputation. People believed we would close, but because there was that level of certainty and we had to go out and get financing.
So you chose to get discretionary capital.
Well, I was the guy at JBG who was primarily responsible for obtaining capital. And I just said to my partners, we need to make a change. We need discretionary capital to compete. There wasn't unanimity in the partnership about going out and trying to get discretionary capital. And so what we did was we raised 2 very small funds. They were each in the $28, $30 million range, just to stick our toe in the water to see if we could do it. And in fact, they were very successful. And we showed we could manage the funds and we could raise the money. And then I was ready to go out and raise a larger fund. And one of our investors was on Yale's investment committee. And I called him for advice because I thought I was going to have to go out, do a road show, go raise money. And he said, let me try to save you a lot of time. I think JBG would be a perfect fit for Yale. I want to introduce you to David Swenson. He did. And 60 days later, we had a commitment from Yale. And Yale's one condition was that they wanted to be the only institutional investor with JBG. They didn't mind if we brought along our individual investors, but they wanted to be the only institutional investor. And that worked for our first 3 funds.
Now, Yale really at that time built a reputation, I think, backing some of the best groups, not just in real estate, but certainly within the real estate sectors, backing some of the best management teams, some of the best investor groups, picking them early and helping them grow, obviously rooted in good investment and teaching best practices. What are some of the things that you learned from the experience from Yale that really helped you throughout the rest of, the next 30 years of the evolution?
There was one fundamental, core belief that he had a number, but I would say the most fundamental belief that David Swenson preached was alignment. And all of our funds and his investments in our funds were structured in a way that created maximum alignment between our funds and Yale. In fact, I thought at some point that Yale should have invested in JBG. They didn't want to, they chose not to as a matter of policy. I thought that would have created complete alignment.
Well, there's some foreshadowing there for an ultimate transition that you made at JBG.
And the other thing I think I learned from David, was his belief. We would have visits with Yale from time to time, and we would go in with a certain amount of trepidation. I mean, we would talk about the transactions we were working on, and we would express a certain amount of trepidation about it, making this, the size investment perhaps that we were making in any given transaction. And David's attitude was, if you have conviction, go for it. And I thought that was really interesting. Now, it was easy for him to say because he had placed a number of fund bets. So he diversified his risk, but he would have been happy. I mean, just as happy if we had come in one day and said, look, we have a $250 million fund. We have a $250 million opportunity. We're going to bet the ranch. We would have never done that, obviously, but it wouldn't have bothered David Swenson had we gone in and said that.
Well, I think even if you would have been a little risk averse, there is something to the notion of really, placing your investment bets when you have maximum conviction and letting that lead, as opposed to what, I would argue some of the largest asset managers in the world do, which is that they invest based on some formulaic approach to asset allocation, which is in some ways devoid from conviction. And I think, you're talking about the alternative, which is to invest when in fact you believe. I think that's the right approach. Now, let's fast forward. So Yale was your first, and for a time, the only institutional investor. JBG, I'll tell the little bit of the story because as some listeners know, I was your partner at JBG. I was there as well for several years, including near the end when we started to then make a transition. Yale became one of several investors, not because they downsized, they continued to increase their investment, but because other investors also joined the fold. JBG grew quite a bit, both in terms of their investment or their assets under management, but also their team. Developed a reputation as one of the best, most prominent developers in the Washington, D.C. area. And then JBG made another transition. So this was maybe the fourth of your transitions, as you meant it. And what JBG did specifically was decided to convert from a private partnership, raise private equity funds into a publicly traded company. There was a merger as well. But I'll let you tell that story. But importantly, why? Why do that?
Along the way, we had 2 or 3 transformational events. And the most transformational prior to the time the company went public was the creation of the JBG Urban entity. And that was coming out of from the 2004, 5, 6 period when we had a number of funds in place with a lot of development in those funds that needed capital on an ongoing basis to fund construction, fund equity, and that we didn't have. That our funds didn't have the capacity to manage. We decided to effectively sell, but we joint ventured, but it was effectively a sale of 90%. We rolled up all of the what I would call pre-development and development assets in 5 funds.
So all of the properties that might have had future potential, but also risk.
And they needed capital. They needed capital for value to be realized, created and realized. So we did this roll up and we closed it. It was a $3 billion deal. It was about $1.5 billion in debt. And we sold 90% of this portfolio. And we did that, 2 weeks before the crash hit. It was just fortuitous. We worked on that transaction for well over a year, and we were able to close it in the fall of 2008, just before the bottom dropped out. That was truly transformational, and it put us in a position to not only survive that crash, but as well to take advantage of opportunities coming out of that crash. So We continued to raise additional funds in our follow-on funds, and the firm was growing. In other words, you're never off the wheel. You're constantly having to grow and get more and more equity, because you're not just buying an operating asset and that's what you're doing. You always need additional capital.
And you built a very large staff, and that staff presumably felt a desire for each of them in each of their roles to also continue to be active, and that probably put pressure on investing.
And because you have this very large staff and a very large management company in place and so forth, and you're working out of closed-end funds that need to cycle cash in and out to investors, you're constantly selling assets. So your portfolio can become very imbalanced and depleted in terms of operating assets that provide ballast. You've got development, and we just decided.
Boy, you would have thought, Mike, well, after your lesson about selling the Berkshire shares too early, you might have wanted to compound or a bit longer.
That's true. But again, given the nature of our funds, we didn't really have the choice to do that. And I mean, we held some deals longer than others. We extended some funds, but fundamentally that wasn't what our investors bought into. And we just decided we really needed a source of permanent capital, that it would be more, given the size of the firm and given its the assets in place and so forth, we would just be better off if we went to the public market and established as I say, a permanent capital.
So fast forward, for those who don't know, JBG then became a public company. You're obviously still on the board, as are some of our other partners, still run by largely the same management team, a wonderful group, and famously, at least in the Washington, D.C. real estate space, became the developer for what they call Amazon's HQ2. Now, obviously, the firm has gone through quite a number of changes through that transition. As you reflect, what were some of the impacts of the capital structure changes? And what do you think the lessons are for people who today might be thinking about building their own firms?
I never wanted to grow JBG just to grow it. There were two drivers among the reasons that we grew. One, we were investing so much capital in this pretty focused geography that we realized along the way that we were actually affecting the value in the submarkets we were involved in. We were creating value all around us.
Well, clearly JBG's development activities also, they led to changing the neighborhoods in a positive way.
That's correct. We wanted to raise sufficient capital to be able to take advantage of that value creation around us. In other words, we wanted to achieve scale in those submarkets, and we needed capital for that. So that was one reason for the growth. Second driver in the growth was, my experience was the firm wasn't going to attract, nor was it going to retain the top talent, the really super talent you need to go execute on an investment plan at scale. And unless you could provide opportunity for those folks. And it's a circle, it's a flywheel. The more opportunity you present, the more folks want to come to work for you, the best people. The moment that you stop the wheel, those folks are going to go elsewhere. The company today, as you say, it has fundamentally the same management company, and they've done a fabulous job. They're in a very challenging market. And so thank goodness they're so talented. But in fact, they are limited by the public markets, if you will, valuation. Now you're in a circumstance where you're not mark to market in a private market. You're mark to market. Your marks are set by a public market that views the world in very broad, paints the world with a very broad brush. And right now, Washington is being painted with only black paint.
Let's double click on that. For 40 years, maybe even longer, the Washington, D.C. real estate market overall has performed very well. The growth in government spending has been part of that, but it's also been a place where a lot of really talented people have come, right? A lot of college graduates. There's been some technology growth. There's obviously been defense and other contractor growth. There's been a huge nonprofit community. The economy diversified and grew in tremendous ways. JBG and other local real estate investors have benefited from that. Currently, as you say, it's a challenging market. Some people talk about that in very happy terms, or they think the government has gotten a bit bloated and think it should cut. Other people are scared about the cuts. But either way, people seem to have agreed that the local economy will suffer and that there will be job losses and the economy will therefore take a downturn. What is your view? Are you that bearish?
I'm pretty bearish on the district specifically, somewhat bearish on Maryland, the least bearish on Northern Virginia, though Northern Virginia has challenges as well. I've been concerned about the district well before Trump came into office. The growth drivers that you just talked about were there over my active career in real estate in Washington. You had four drivers. You had the law firms, trade associations, government contractors, and the federal government itself. And I always explain when investors would ask me about Washington, I said it's a real easy explanation. Think of Washington as a mall with one massive anchor, the federal government. What we know about that anchor is that the amount it spends next year is going to be more than the amount it spent this year. And though we're only 2% of the population, we get 20 some odd percent of federal expenditures are right here. And so it's a leaky bucket. And so we don't know what the percentage of growth is going to be, but we do know there's going to be growth. That was what happened.
And you think that has fundamentally changed?
Oh, very much so. So what has changed? And again, I stress this is pre-Trump. All of the economic drivers for Washington are no longer growing. The law firms are not growing. The trade associations are not. All the trade associations, by the way, the advent of trade associations in Washington started in the 80s really. The headquarters for trade associations before the 80s and early 90s was Chicago. Everybody relocated to Washington when they realized how important it was to lobby the government directly. And so there was tremendous growth in the presence of associations in Washington. When was the last time you heard of any new major employer coming to Washington, coming to the district? There may be examples. I'm not as close to it.
There are certainly examples to Northern Virginia.
Northern Virginia is different. But the law firms are shrinking, have been shrinking. The trade associations are fundamentally not growing. The contractor work has been dropping off. And the federal government hasn't been growing. Federal government, they've been recycling and churning, but there really hasn't been any growth. So you end up with this sort of record high vacancy rate in office assets, which, by the way, the majority of the office asset stock that is vacant is obsolete and requires enormous amounts of capital.
Now, to be fair to the district, that office problem is nationwide.
That's right. But I think it's exacerbated. It's particularly acute in DC. DC is not attracting industry and doesn't have a replacement. Fundamentally, for all of this. So enter Trump. I'm a skeptic about how much Doge can do. I'm a skeptic about the sale of office buildings. You need a market. You need an economic thesis around what somebody's going to do with stuff. Is certainly not helpful. And I think to the extent that you could have had some sort of recovery going on in DC, it hurts. It just hurts it. Northern Virginia has the Pentagon. And a completely, well, start even higher, start at the state level. They have a much more pro-business attitude. DC and Maryland have suffocating regulatory frameworks. It's hard to do business in those places, even in good times.
And so Northern Virginia is business friendly, certainly lower tax. I would argue they have more than just the Pentagon and defense contractors. Obviously, they have those. But there's been a huge technology wave as well, starting many years ago with America Online.
I was going to get the second piece of that is technology, which to a large extent revolves around the Pentagon. I think both AI, cybersecurity are significant. And we're seeing that at National Landing.
And now is your view that the headwinds that the Washington National Capital Region are facing currently, or let's say specific to Northern Virginia, where you seem to have a little bit less concern, but still some, are the headwinds short term? In other words, if you had not a 6-month view or a 12-month view, but if you had a 5-year, 10-year view, does Washington, D.C., does the National Capital Region overall, does it recover? Does it continue to grow? Or is your bearishness long-term in nature or short-term?
I think my bearishness for the district is pretty long-term. It's pretty long-term. I feel substantially better about Northern Virginia. It's a different regulatory climate. It's got different economic drivers. People want to locate in Northern Virginia. I just don't see that in the district. I'm having a lot of trouble seeing what the economic drivers are for the district. But Washington is an amazing city. And, it's still the free capital of the world. So I would never count it out. But if you're talking about the next several years, that's really what I'm focused on. I mean, I think in the long run, Washington will somehow endure and hopefully prosper. What I have trouble discerning is what's the plan for replacing those fundamental economic drivers that have enabled the city to become what it was over the last 30, 40 years.
Let's press on that, not from the perspective of a public policy answer, but from the perspective of an investor. What I heard is belief in Washington over the long term, but in the near term, perhaps better to invest elsewhere, unless, of course, you can buy really cheaply. And you were on the board of CoStar. You had access to lots of information about real estate innovation. Where would you invest? The next 3, 5, 7 years.
Another really good question. I think I would focus on markets. Maybe some of my answer is going to be political in nature, which is they're red places and they're blue places. And for the most part, I think I'd invest in the red places. I'd invest where the growth was easier to forecast. Washington, D.C., the office market is decimated right now, if you will. It's just terrible, not getting better. So some people are going to say, well, I am going to go take advantage of that and I'm going to buy at incredibly distressed prices. I don't know where value is. I don't know if land has any value in the district. I hope it does, but I really don't know the answer to that. So I don't know at what distressed price it makes sense to own something that if you're going to buy it in that speculative a manner, if that is what you're going to do, which is, to me, that investment should be clocking at least 15% a year, 20% a year. That to me is like buying raw land almost. And so you have to take into account, maybe you can buy office land for $100 a foot. Sounds unbelievably cheap, right? Now you got to compound that. How long is it going to be before you can use that land?
And could you find something that is less risky in some other market where you can compound at a similar or equal rate of return And obviously, we all know that it's better to, if you could earn the same level of return, one way being not very risky.
Or a little less, but with less risk on a risk adjusted basis. I just think you're better off going to locales that, as I say, you can more comfortably project reasonable, consistent economic growth.
Let's move outside of the Washington, D.C. real estate industry. And let's talk about maybe your family. You expressed your own entrepreneurial streak. Obviously, your father and grandfather, it sounds like your cousins and uncles were also entrepreneurial in nature. So are your kids, both of your sons. What role do you have in helping their businesses grow? And how does it feel to see them succeed?
Well, it's terrific to witness your children pursuing their own pathways. And it's a bit of a tightrope that you walk. I wear a lot of hats with both of my sons. It's really important working, though, with family as closely as we work together, that you separate, that you're not talking about business all the time. Just be a father.
Well, Mike, I got to tell you, and I know we're not related, but you have played that role for me as well. And not everybody knows this, but when I was seeking to start my own investment business and I was seeking to work with David Rubenstein, which, as people know, I've been able to do now for 7 years or so, I was really thinking through how to approach it, what business proposal to make, how to structure it so that it would be fair and it would create the sort of alignment that you mentioned you had with Yale. And you were instrumental in helping me through all those points. You continue to be instrumental as we grow here at Declarations Real Estate Business. And I'm very grateful. I imagine your sons are as well.
Well, that's very generous of you. And as you know, I hope you know, I got more out of it maybe than you did.
Mike, you and your family, you've always been charitable. And I've seen you dedicate your time and your resources to projects pretty close to your heart. It's been the Washington, D.C. Building Museum. It's been Georgetown Day School, as well as other local schools, synagogues, hospitals, whether it's Sibley or Johns Hopkins. You've given in so many ways. What inspires you? Why do you give back that way?
I think primarily because I'm able to. I pinch myself every day. I am so grateful for all that has happened to me. I'm just grateful for the life I enjoy. And others are not as fortunate as I am. And I think we all have a responsibility to try to leave the world in a little bit better shape than we found it, or try to at least. So I think there are a lot of ways to help, a lot of ways to give. And as I say, I'm able to, and it gives me great pleasure to sort of focus my resources, whatever they are, on efforts that will improve somebody's condition or sort of the overall condition of, an institution. If I can add value and do that, then I want to do it. It's a source of real joy.
I love hearing that. And I can see the joy. Now, let's move now to a list of our standard closing questions here. What's a book that most influenced your thinking or your personal development?
There have been so many books I've read. The one book that I refer to often and that I give to family and friends is a book. It's titled Too Soon, Old, Too Late, Smart. It's by a guy named Dr. David Livingston. He passed away. It's a collection of essays that are primarily about personal responsibility and relationships. And I strongly, strongly recommend it.
It's a wonderful book. I think you've given that to me, but perhaps more than once. What is the best advice that you received from your parents or that you've given to your own kids?
I received so much good advice from my parents. There wouldn't be one thing. The situation I referred to earlier in the conversation about talking to my dad about when I was at the crossroads, that was pretty good advice. That ranks right up there.
Can you imagine if you had only asked him whether or not you should sell the Berkshire Hathaway?
He never got over my selling the Berkshire Hathaway. He was so upset. I mean, it's one of those, oh my gosh. He just was beside himself. Best advice to my kids, listen to your father.
Michael, the U.S. Declaration of Independence, as you know, talks about freedom for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What do you do in pursuit of happiness?
I didn't conceive of this. I read it somewhere. At some point, this sort of came into my brain from some source. But I think there are 4 components to happiness, fundamentally. You need to have something to do. You need to have someone to love. And you need to have something to look forward to, along with good health. And if you have 3 out of those 4, you're doing, I mean, if you have 1 out of those 4, you're doing well. If you have 4 out of 4, I don't know how you can not be happy.
Well, I wish you all 4 of those 4. And Mike, I want to thank you yet again for joining. And this is a wonderful conversation. And it's so great to be able to share our relationship and this experience with the world. Thank you yet again.
It's my pleasure, Todd. Thanks a lot. I've enjoyed it.
This podcast is provided for discussion and informational purposes only, for use by Declaration Partners, LP, together with its affiliates, referred to as Declaration. The information discussed in this podcast may change at any time without notice, and there is no duty by Declaration to update any person to whom this information is provided. This podcast does not constitute an offer to sell or the solicitation of an offer to purchase any investment product or any interest in the fund or any other investment vehicles or accounts managed or advised by Declaration, a Declaration investment product, in any jurisdiction to any person. Any such offer or solicitation for interest in any Declaration investment product will only be made pursuant to such Declaration investment product's definitive offering documents, which contain a description of the material terms, including risk factors, conflicts of interest, fees and charges, and regulatory and tax considerations relating to such Declaration investment product, and which should be reviewed carefully by potential investors prior to making an investment decision. This podcast does not constitute tax or legal advice. The listener is urged to consult a professional tax and or legal advisors regarding the possible tax, legal, economic, regulatory, or other risks and consequences associated with any investment, and must be able to bear the risks involved. This podcast may contain certain forward-looking statements which constitute Declaration's views with respect to future events, which can be identified by the use of forward-looking terminology such as intend, seek, expect, target, project, or endeavor. These statements are made based upon such views as they exist as of the date herein. There is no assurance that such views are correct or will prove, with the passage of time, to be correct. Actual events or results may differ materially from those contemplated by such forward-looking statements as a result of factors beyond Declaration's control, including, without limitation, any disruptions in global, regional, or local financial, credit, or real estate markets, acts of God, fire, hurricanes, tropical storms, floods, earthquakes, or other natural disasters, outbreaks of an infectious disease, pandemic, or any other serious public health concern, war, terrorism, labor strikes, electricity shortages, or other national or local emergencies, or any combination of the foregoing. David M. Rubenstein is an anchor investor in Declaration Partners Real Estate Fund II and is not an employee of Declaration. Neither the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission nor the Securities Regulatory Authority of any state or other jurisdiction has passed upon the accuracy or adequacy of this podcast. No compensation has been awarded to any speaker for statements made that are either testimonials or endorsements. However, certain speakers may be current or former investors in certain Declaration investment products and may receive reduced fees, priority terms, priority access, co-investment rates, among other preferential treatment, which may pose a conflict of interest. Certain speakers may also be affiliates and or service providers that receive compensation from Declaration for services provided in their service provider capacity, but have not been compensated specifically for any testimonials or endorsements made herein. All statements made on the podcast are the opinions and beliefs of the speaker and may not necessarily represent the opinions, beliefs, and position of Declaration. Consequently, from the foregoing, no reliance whatsoever should be placed on this podcast, and no decision including any investment decision should be made based on this podcast or on the information contained herein.